Exclusive tutorials, study sheets, and storyboards are available on my Patreon. I'm Kai, a 90-year-old manga artist from the UK. Today I want to talk about 5 beginner mistakes when making manga. Let's get into it. The first beginner mistake is using too many headshots in your pages. So here I've drawn out 2 pages. The paneling here is pretty good, but when you draw too many headshots in the pages, it actually makes the reading experience a lot more boring. And I think what a lot of beginners forget to do is add in establishing shots instead of adding in these headshot pages. But you should really be considering your readers, since establishing shots help your reader know where your character is in the manga. It's not you can't use headshots, as you can see I'm using one here, but it's important to not use too many of them. You can make things a lot more interesting if you show some of the backgrounds, or maybe show different angles in terms of, where you're viewing the characters from. Essentially what does make manga a lot more interesting is when you vary things enough. This includes like the paneling or the shots that you're using. You can also show an object that a character is holding, or some kind of random object in the background. Here I'll draw out a few angles that you might be able to use when you draw manga or comics. Someone like Naoki Urasawa uses a lot of sort of headshots because his stuff is kind of based off movies, the way that he decides to set up his shots and everything, so it sort of makes sense for him, and he finds ways to make it super interesting still. Mostly because he does switch up the angle of the heads a lot, and he also puts an emphasis on drawing super detailed and interesting expressions. I think this, with also the dialogue that he's actually putting down, makes it very interesting. Next I want to talk about too much empty space in the page. I don't think this is necessarily wrong. There are mangas like Dragonball that do it super well, but I think a lot of beginner manga artists do it subconsciously, and it ends up making pages feel super flat. It also ends up being less of a stylistic choice and more of a skill set thing. Nowadays more mangas fill their negative space with backgrounds. For example, Jujutsu Kaisen does this a lot. It is important to realize where you want to come from when you sort of fill in your negative spaces. First I want to go over covering the basic contrast and values of each page, and here you can tell the differences between each of these pages in terms of their value and how they feel. You'll notice it gets more interesting when there's more black on the page, and it ends up feeling a lot less empty too. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to cover your whole page in black, it's just to follow the general vibe of that. And there's a lot of different ways to add contrast to your page, for example thicker lines or adding more lines in general. Those small things can really help your contrast. Here I'll show when you're adding grey into your pages and screen tone and things like that. A lot of people try and shade the screen tone like they're shading a grayscale image, which just isn't the case. And you'll see here these tones up here look very plain and flat. And I think the reason for that is because the midtones are too similar. You'll notice the pages that have more contrasting values are more interesting, and they also pop a lot more. And this is what a lot of shonens do. But shoujos do sometimes use full grey on a page, and it still works. I can't speak for all shoujos, but in the ones that I've read, occasionally they use thicker lines to contrast the greys. They also do this in shonens too when there's some grey, especially in mangas like Danadan and Rent-A-Girlfriend. The black doesn't have to be like always a full black spot, it can also just be the lines or outlines of a character. I'm no expert when it comes to shoujos though, so take my word with a grain of salt. You also notice I use a gradient instead of a flat screen tone, and that can typically make things a lot more interesting too. Here I'm showing how values can affect the page. For example, on this left side here you have a page that is just fully white with characters' outlines, and on the other page I've edited it so that there's a lot more black on the page and there's more general interest. And you'll notice the page pops a lot more, so imagine if you're a good artist and you add these things into your own manga pages right now. It would add a lot more and make the pages a lot more interesting too. I also want to show how contrast can affect characters. These are super unclean sketches though. You don't necessarily always have to add a lot of black for a character to be interesting. Sometimes Mangaka replace it with hatching or screen tone. It really does depend. And I don't think there's necessarily a wrong way to do it as long as it makes sense and it works for you. But you also want to be conscious of what you're doing and how you're approaching it. On the far left here you have a character that has no black whatsoever, and on the next one you have a character that's fully black in terms of what they're wearing. And when you do a more simplified page, it makes more sense to sort of flat your characters like this and make them fully black in terms of what they're wearing. If you add too many shades and then you don't have anything in your backgrounds, then it can make your page feel super flat. I think the reason Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball works so well is because his characters are super simple too, and his backgrounds are simple. And it's not like his characters are super detailed and then his backgrounds don't even really exist. I don't really think it would work as well like that. It would feel super empty and it would feel incomplete. Even though these are super quick sketches, I think you can see how being conscious of these things will help you to create more interesting pages. And on this fourth one here, I'm adding in hatching, which you can also add screen tone or gradients to, which I'll show later on. And on the furthest right, I've also put a character that has full hatching and basically nothing else. Here I'm going to tweak one of the drawings to show that it also works with screen tone or gradient. This kind of shading is also found in Jujutsu Kaisen, and you'll find that a lot of sort of mangas in general do use gradients or screen tone and black in this kind of way for the clothing. Here you can also add hatching to sort of be the midtones between the screen tone and the blacks, which you also see a lot in manga. You can also have it as fully grey or gradient, which is what a lot of shoujos do. Next I'll talk about not using enough panel variation or not making interesting enough panels. Panels are basically just the squares. This is a mistake a lot of beginners make, is that they draw the panels too symmetrical. Typically with interesting paneling in manga, you'll notice that the panels typically are asymmetrical, which means both the sides are not the same, they're typically different in some kind of way. This will make your panels a lot more interesting. In addition, you don't want to line up your panels vertically, you want to sort of make them different than each other and move them to the side a little. You notice this in a lot of manga if you go and look at them. In addition, I'm showing how with a 4-panel page you can make it a lot better just by doing the things that I just explained. Here I'm showing a character introduction scene, and you'll notice that the paneling here is pretty good and the composition works. But a more interesting way to do it might be to cut out the panel border in general. You don't really need a reason to do this as long as it's interesting. On the bottom here I also want to show an example of cutting out the panel border in this kind of page. To the side of the character here I have sort of screen tones. As you can see I wrote tones there, and you can actually make these seep through the page and sort of become the background to the page and behind all the panels itself. And a lot of shoujos do let the tone seep out and become part of the page. Here I'm showing a few other panel compositions. Next I want to talk about the next beginner mistake, which is not using enough reference. Typically when you're drawing your manga art, you sort of want to use a lot of reference from different manga artists and find out what they're doing and use that to sort of bring to your own work and apply it in some kind of way. This is how you can keep improving while you sort of make your own manga, which is pretty much the main goal of if you're making your first manga. You want to sort of keep improving as you move forward. So you have to be super conscious of what other manga artists are doing and sort of find ways to bring that to your own work. The way that they hatch, the way that they use blacks, different things like that. Even smaller things like how a manga artist might do their speech bubbles is something that you could really bring to your work. And finding different ways that mangakas do things and bringing that to your own stuff means that a lot of the times you can vary your stuff a lot and add a lot more interest into your pages. You can have elements of shoujo or seinen in your stuff and different artists in those individual sort of demographics, which can also help you to build a style and make your stuff a lot more interesting. Naturally, style shouldn't be the first thing in your mind, but it is good to keep in mind in the future. And last but not least, I want to talk about putting a lot of time into sort of storyboarding your mangas, because storyboarding is going to be the most important part of your entire process. Storyboarding is basically going to tell you how all your individual pages come out and how they're going to look in the end, in terms of format and readability, which is going to be the most important thing when people are reading a manga, which is going to be like, oh, is this exciting to read? And also, is this readable? So you want to make things pretty interesting to read in terms of the paneling and shots that you choose, but you also want to make it sort of readable in general, so things aren't too complicated and people can follow along super easily, which can be a difficult thing to do. But if you use enough manga reference in general and sort of bring what they're doing into your own work, I think that even this stage can be a lot easier with that in mind, because when you're doing stuff straight from your mind and you're just starting out, it's going to be a lot more difficult. Since we've gone over all of the basic tips that I wanted to cover, I wanted to throw in a few little tiny ones that couldn't warrant a whole, section. First of all, you typically do want to use monochrome layers when you draw your mangas, because this is going to make your lines a lot more sharp than if you was using a colored layer. The reason for this is because color allows for the full expression of all the grays between black and white, but monochrome only recognizes black and white as a whole, so the colors are going to be a lot sharper, or the inks are going to be a lot sharper. In addition, changing your screen tones as you approach different parts of your artwork is super important. If something's in the foreground, you can change your sort of screen tone density to something lower, so maybe a 30. But if something's super far away or it's just a character standing, it could be like an 80, which is the smallest. It really does depend. I think it's also good to sort of try to test gradients versus actual flat screen tone too and see which one you prefer and which one works better in different areas. I think that you could find good uses for both of them. That's pretty much all from me though. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. Peace out.